last year's conference, we spoke of the world, of the capitalist system, as entering a period of historic turmoil. Now, far be it from a Marxist to say we told you so, but what a year we have seen. Not only are we entering a period of absolute historic crisis, we are teetering on the edge of that historic crisis. We said that 2008 was not a hiccup in the capitalist system. It was a paradigm shift, a historic crisis, an implosion that was only delayed with drastic measures. Now, all the routes of escape that capitalism used to save itself from destruction in 2008 are closed. What we are witnessing today are the tremors of ultimate collapse. Capitalism, as it did in the 1930s, has reached a historic limit. Productivity has stalled and gone into reverse in many instances. International stock markets are hemorrhaging tens of billions of dollars. In fact, they've taken the biggest tumble that we've seen since the 1970s. Key markets, such as shipping and oil, are tanking, no pun intended, due to a historic crisis of overproduction. Oil prices, in fact, have fallen 18% since January the 1st and 72% since the summer of 2014. I'll try to be fairly light on the figures, but we are scientists, comrades. The Baltic Dry Index, which measures the cost of shipping raw materials globally, has now fallen to its lowest point since records began in 1985. The evidence is clear. Another financial crash is impending. We might see it before the end of the year. And as I mentioned, the former routes of escape used by the forces of capitalism, bailing out the banks and the saving grace of the Chinese economy, are closed. Global debt is astronomical. The so-called Great Fall of China in August saw world trade suffer its biggest fall in 6 years. And the stock market collapse faced by the Chinese markets saw the government intervene, injecting $48 billion in order to maintain some level of productivity. Now, the crisis in Chinese finance means that the country is presently focusing its efforts for social unrest. It's presently spending more money on internal security than it does on defence, which for China is rather striking. There is no way out for the ruling class. Even bourgeois economists are starting to wake up to this fact. In fact, RBS, one of the leading British banks, is speaking to its investors of a return of capital as opposed to a return on capital. Investors are being told to sell up. Under these conditions of crisis, we're witnessing a widespread rejection of the political establishment. We're seeing populist movements of both the right and the left springing up all over the world. For every Podemos, a Le Pen. For every Corbyn, a Donald Trump. And in these circumstances, the ruling classes are eating their own tail. We're witnessing white-collar sectors in open revolt in Britain. I'm sure you're all following with interest the junior doctors standoff with Jeremy Hunt, a man who's bringing back rhyming slang. Now, the fact that Jeremy Hunt has been forced to impose his toxic contract on junior doctors is evidence of the ruling classes attempting to call the bluff of unionised public sector workers. I've been down to 2 pickets, and I can tell you from personal experience, the doctors are willing to fight him all the way. The ruling classes are gearing up for the fight, and the increasingly radicalised workers that they are exploiting and oppressing are willing to take them on. We saw a nearly total mandate in favour of that strike from the BMA members and mass public support. So the Conservative Party is playing a rather dangerous game, and as I'll indicate further in the introduction, the game they're playing has revolutionary implications. Elsewhere in the world, we're seeing the continued horrors of exploitation, reaction against the forces of imperialism, particularly in the Middle East. The Syrian civil war is raging on, a product of the blunders of Western imperialism in the region and the stalling of the Arab Revolution. IS remains an insidious force of murder and destruction, a monster of capitalism's own making, a result of a foreign policy strategy which, since at least the Suez Crisis, has resembled raising up today's gang of cutthroats to murder yesterday's gang of cutthroats. And as a result of this, we've seen a massive displacement of people, horrendous loss of life, and barbarism running roughshod over the entire region. Closer to home, we're seeing a house divided in Europe A Grexit, Greece leaving the EU, was averted narrowly in July, but despite a huge programme of quantitative easing, of printing money by the European Central Bank, the Eurozone is locked in a state of paralysis. Despite 1.5% growth in the past year, in that same period, the ECB had to pump 1.1 trillion euros into European banks. Meanwhile, euro inflation stood at 0.2% in December, which is about half as much as predicted, and only a tenth of the ECB's 2% target. The question has to be asked, comrades, where is all this money going? It's going to banks and large corporations who are sitting uselessly on billions of euros, preferring to speculate on stock and currency markets rather than invest in production. And why? Because there's no profit to be made from investing in production. Meanwhile, we're seeing a debt crisis racking weaker EU economies. Greece has already had to be bailed out, and Portugal or Spain could be next. High unemployment and low productivity are widespread, and the two most popular measures presented by the ruling classes to combat this situation are, firstly, the boosting of public expenditure, particularly on infrastructure, and so-called labour market reform with a focus on improving flexibility. Now, we know, as scientific socialists, that more spending on infrastructure will not benefit the working classes if the so-called wealth creators, the banks and the big businesses, refuse to invest in and develop productive forces. In effect, what we're going to see, and what we're already seeing, are the European working classes hit by austerity and low pay, of the ruling classes transferring the cost of propping up their own diseased economy on the workers' shoulders. And the present situation in Greece is now a model for the rest of Europe. It's the future that many European member states are witnessing, in fact, today. Public spending in Greece has been cut by more than 30%. National assets are being sold off to foreign corporations. GDP is collapsing, and unemployment is standing at 25%, closer to 60% for youth. Of course, the other major crisis afflicting Europe is a human crisis, the refugee crisis that was massively exacerbated by the disaster in Syria that I spoke of earlier. The refugee crisis in Europe has thrown the ruling classes into disarray, as well as demonstrating their callousness. In 2015, 1.5 million migrants and refugees were estimated to have arrived in Europe from various countries, particularly Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq, and nearly 2,000 have died making that dangerous journey to relative safety in Europe. Now, the efforts by the ruling classes in Europe to deal with this crisis have utterly beggared belief. We've seen camps, appalling conditions established in Hungary. We've seen Swiss and Danish governments seizing migrants' assets. When I say assets, I'm talking about phones and iPads in order to pay for their keep. Even under the perverse logic of capitalism, even under the limited morality of liberal morality, this completely beggars belief. These people are being treated worse than dogs. At the same time, the EU gave 3 billion euros to Erdogan, a vicious reactionary, to make Turkey more attractive to migrants, to invest in making Turkey more attractive to migrants, to serve as a buffer to Europe. Meanwhile, Erdogan sits like some kind of Ottoman sultan, accepting tribute from the leaders of European member states. Now, the anti-migrant sentiment stirred up by the reactionary ruling classes, combined with austerity measures throughout the EU, have led to an enormous surge in Euroscepticism. This confused sort of coalition of national chauvinism and soft left or liberal hand-wringing over the anti-democratic nature of the EU is turning member states against the common market. We've seen reactionary nationalist governments established in Poland and anti-EU nationalists elsewhere gaining strength. There's also a powerful anti-EU sentiment developing in Britain. We're heading for a referendum on the possibility of leaving the EU, in which there is a real possibility of a Brexit. Now, this would spell disaster for the Tories, so I suppose it's not all bad, who are already being torn apart internally over this issue. In spite of all the media bias focusing on the internal divisions in Labour, the most significant internal divisions in a major party are in the Conservative Party over the question of the EU. Now, as Marxists, we understand the world in dialectical terms. We understand that powerful forces produce reactions, and that situations often transform into their opposite. And dialectically, the crisis of capitalism is begetting its historic opposite: revolutionary ferments, revolutionary currents throughout the world. Widespread austerity is provoking new, potentially revolutionary movements in Europe and beyond. In Portugal, a right-wing government was overthrown by a left coalition, and the betrayals of Syriza in Greece have resulted in massive strike action, particularly by the youth. The final betrayal of the Venezuelan revolution is provoking mass reaction from the people who are standing up in defence of the Venezuelan revolution, in spite of all of its limitations. Much closer to home, in Britain, we've seen Jeremy Corbyn totally upend the political apple cart in British politics. Last year, we've seen a Labour politician come to power with genuine left reformist credentials as a result of an absolutely inconceivable historical accident. No one could have seen Jeremy Corbyn coming. I'm fairly convinced not even Jeremy Corbyn saw Jeremy Corbyn coming. But we do know that Corbyn, the accident of Corbyn, expressed a historic necessity. We know that resentment has been building up in the traditional Labour electorate for many, many years as a result of the betrayals of the Blair years. And finally, those currents, those working class currents, those student currents, have found their expression. We saw a stunning victory at the leadership election. Jeremy Corbyn achieved a 59% mandate in a 4-horse race. Comrades, this does not happen. This does not happen. We saw a massive expansion of the ranks of the party. We've now gained more Labour activists since the leadership election than there are Conservative activists in the country. And if that doesn't cheer you, then you're in the wrong room. And the ruling classes are afraid. They are afraid of what Corbyn and his supporters mean, because Labour has historically served to save capitalism when its main establishment party is defeated electorally. It placates the masses and prevents revolutionary movements from forming. They will use everything in their power to defeat Jeremy Corbyn before he has a chance of implementing his left reformist programme, because they know for the first time that he's not a Labour leader that they can truly count on. The logical conclusion of the degeneration of Labour, the new Labour pro-market stance that was barely indistinguishable for many voters from the Tories, that made Labour safe, is now a thing of the past. In spite of the Blairites whinging about dinosaur politics, about how Corbyn's socialism is a political persuasion of the past, nothing now looks more outdated than a Blairite. So Corbyn is not safe for the ruling classes. He is not safe for capitalism. His platform poses a direct threat to their interests. And they're doing everything they can to defeat him from within and from without. The Blairites within the Parliamentary Labour Party, along with the Tories and the mainstream press, are all colluding to destroy Corbyn before he has a chance to implement his left reformist programme, because they understand that, as servants of the market, Corbyn is their shared enemy. But in spite of all of this, Corbyn's position hasn't weakened, it's strengthened. He's made gains in every by-election that Labour has presently sat. He won another one just yesterday. Now, in much the same way that Corbyn provided an expression to radical left currents building in Britain for many years that hadn't found their political expression at the time, in America, Bernie Sanders' campaign and the gains, the surprise gains that Bernie Sanders' campaign has made, has served much the same purpose. In fact, I will go so far as to say that the gains of the Sanders campaign in America represents a political revolutionary movement in the context of that country. We've seen young people in particular galvanised by Sanders' campaign. Latest polls are now showing that socialism, as a concept, is viewed more positively than capitalism by young people in America. Thank you. The Democratic Party establishment is in utter disarray. Their surefire candidate, Hillary Clinton, is continually losing ground in the primaries. She has nothing resembling the energy, nothing resembling the momentum that Bernie Sanders' Scandinavian socialist, democratic socialist campaign has been able to generate. In much the same way as Corbyn, not only is Sanders recognised as a man of genuine principle, but his politics represent a true rejection of the status quo. We've seen Sanders break the record for donations, and he surpassed all expectations in the Iowa and New Hampshire caucuses. As with Corbyn, the American ruling classes cannot depend on senators to save capitalism from ruin, and they will use everything at their disposal to ensure that he cannot enact the programme which so threatens them. Now, I'm going to read you a quote, and I'm not going to tell you who wrote it until the end, but just bear it in mind. We are living in a time when trust in American institutions has collapsed. A recent Pew survey shows that less than 20% of Americans trust the government always or most of the time. And a CNN poll showed that 60% think the American dream is unachievable today. Against this backdrop, it's no surprise that America is in revolt. Honesty and trustworthiness matters more than whether a candidate has experience, or can win in November according to voters, and the establishment isn't delivering anything resembling what the American populace desires in their political leaders. There is no doubt that Americans have spoken, and they're done with business as usual. Now, with a few choice word changes, that could be an article from the Marxist Student Federation press, but in actual fact, that was written by Douglas C. Schoen, who served as a pollster for Bill Clinton, and he was writing in Fox News, writing for the Fox News website. The crisis in the American ruling class, to the point that even their standard mouthpieces are unable to ignore the sea change, has global implications, but it also reflects global trends. We're seeing a mass rejection of the political status quo. Radical politics is back on the agenda in a big way. Now, if there's one thing that the last year has taught us, however, it's that we can have no illusions in the capacity of left reformism to provide the kinds of reforms it promises, or indeed to improve the lot of the majority of people in any meaningful way. Tsipras' betrayal of the Greek people shows the true face of left reformist politics. Now, imagine a world where everything goes to plan and Corbyn and Sanders win elections in their respective countries. The ruling classes, in an era of crisis, would not tolerate their programmes. We would see massive deinvestment, a strike of capital. We've already seen, in Britain, rumblings from an unnamed general that the military establishment in Britain would countenance a political coup, a military coup against a democratically elected leader, were Corbyn to come to power. Now, this is what is at stake. The fact that the ruling classes are countenancing such a move demonstrates that the current is blowing towards a revolutionary movement, and we need revolutionary change in society. We're in desperate need of it. But that means a revolutionary organisation to provide understanding and leadership, what we as Marxists call the subjective factor. The time is right to put your politics into practice. Your first task is to educate yourself, to understand the global situation and ground yourself in Marxist theory, which presumably is why you're here. That's very admirable. This gives you a major advantage. You have something that the reformists, that the ruling classes do not have. You have the correct class perspective on the nature of the present crisis of capitalism. The best thing you can do for humanity is to take what you learned today at this conference and go back to your CLPs, go back to your student unions, go back to your Marxist societies, go back to your peers, to your local communities, and put your politics to work. If you want inspiration, just today, I'm sure we'll hear lots of examples in the reports about the great work that members of the Marxist Student Federation have been doing up and down the country. But perhaps a more dramatic example, look to the South African students who've been fighting a very successful and bitter struggle for free education in that country. Now, Lenin understood the importance of the youth movement first educating itself in, grounding itself in Marxist theory, and then putting their politics into practice. And I'm just about to finish, so I will end with a quote that Marx gave in 1920 to the Third All-Russia Congress for the Russian Youth Communist League, where he sought to motivate the revolutionary youth of Russia and explain to them their necessary tasks and responsibilities. Tasks and responsibilities that still hold true today, that hold true for you. The Young Communist League must be a shock force, helping in every job and displaying initiative and enterprise. The League should be an organisation enabling any worker to see that it consists of people whose teachings he perhaps does not understand and whose teachings he may not immediately believe, but from whose practical work and activity he can see that they are really people who are showing him the right road. So, take that as your mantra, educate yourself, ground yourself in the theory, develop that class perspective, have the critical Marxist lens on the present situation in world politics, and put it visibly into practice. If you take anything away from that conference, make it this. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the day, and thank you very much.